afternoon, all. This afternoon session will be given to us by Professor Naureen Durrani. Her focus will be on gender, education, and conflict. Durrani is a professor of education in the Graduate School of Education in Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. I met Naureen in 2012, I think, for the first time, when she was at Sussex. So she moved from Sussex University to Kazakhstan and has a wide range of international experience in teaching and research, alongside knowledge exchange and stakeholder consultation. Naureen's research interests lie in the social, cultural, political, and economic influences on education policy formulation and enactment, and the outcomes of education on identity formation and gender relations. Naureen draws on post-structuralist and post-colonial theories to produce contextually relevant and situated studies on a range of topics, including curriculum, teacher governance and education, and citizenship and gender identities. If I may, Naureen, the one thing that you hold for me in terms of your work is your focus on gender, which is what you are doing today. You're giving us an engagement with gender education and conflict. And I regard you as one of the foremost leaders in education on this area. So welcome, Naureen, from I hear a very cold Kazakhstan. Welcome to our Africa Hub workshop.
Thank you very much, Azim. I'm missing Cape Town in this lovely season that you have, weather that you have there, but I enjoyed the music very much. And my apologies, I couldn't join you yesterday because I teach on Mondays. So thank you very much, hoping to getting to know more of you. Okay, so thank you very much again. And as Azim said, I will bring gender into the discussion of education and conflict. You've been since yesterday looking at the relationship between education and conflict through a political economy lens. And my role today is how gender features within that relationship. So just a few pointers on the structure to help you navigate my talk. First of all, I want to situate the significance of gender to education in contexts affected by conflict and other crises and emergencies as well. Second, I will look at gender at a conceptual level and identify problems with existing theorization in policy as well as practice. Third, I connect gender with conflict and peace building. Fourth, I will look at how education might support peace building or foster conflict. And last, I will situate gender education and conflict in the Central Asian context. As Azim mentioned, for the last 3 years, I've been living, working and researching Central Asia. And originally I'm from South Asia. So the examples that I will be drawing today will be mostly from my own experience in Central Asia and South Asia. And I hope these tools will give you food for thought, applying these concepts to your own context in different African countries. So, how do gender education and conflict relate? As you know, we have this Sustainable Development Goals, which are a prominent feature of the development and educational agenda, and it's globally applicable. So where do gender education and conflict meet? It is predominantly in the Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, which look up to education for promoting gender equality, as well as a culture of peace and nonviolence. So why is gender education and conflict significant at the level of policy? Well, we have research evidence that links gender inequality to violent conflict. For example, one study links gender equality with lower levels of armed conflict within a country. Another global analysis, quantitative analyses, indicate that a greater likelihood of armed conflict, both internal and external, is more associated with high levels of gender inequality in education, as calculated from group differences in mean years of schoolings. So what this evidence argue is that it provides a strong argument that addressing gender inequality can contribute to more stable societies. Now, how gender and conflict relate? So it's not just about conflict, but in any situation of emergency, natural disaster or health crisis, such as the current global pandemic, there is evidence that these emergency situations are experienced differently by men and women, boys and girls. And why is that? Because existing gender order, it creates differentiated risks, vulnerabilities, and capacities to deal with an emergency situation. So, for example, in conflict contexts, we would predominantly see that men and boys are at a greater risk of being recruited into militias and fighting forces. And while women are more likely to be a target of sexual abuse or maybe asked to join non-combatant roles such as cooking and cleaning and other things. So these vulnerabilities may then actually lead to a desire to protect women and girls. And it means that they are a greater risk of being prevented from accessing social services, including educational services, because of the specific gender-specific risks that they experience. Nevertheless, both conflict and other emergencies also offer an opportunity to transform existing gender norms. For example, in the current pandemic, more men have started contributing towards household chores with quarantine measures. Women often are required for survival reasons to take up paid employment. But often it's the case that these transformations are not long-term, and these transformations may actually mean carrying a double burden, particularly for women. Let's talk a bit about the gender dynamics during the current pandemic. So the fallout from the pandemic is higher on those economic sectors such as social services and informal economy, where globally women predominate these sectors. Also, women globally spend more time on unpaid care work and domestic work. And during the pandemic, in many countries, women have seen an increase in their unpaid care and domestic labor. So school closures have also contributed to domestic responsibilities. And even before the pandemic, it is women who largely educate children at home. And now that responsibility of homeschooling has also inequitably fallen on the shoulders of women. Globally, again, we have seen a surge in gender-based violence. Same is the case in Central Asia, also in Kazakhstan, because of restrictions. Women mobility is restricted. They are far away from the help and the support, as well as the frustration and the lack or the loss of job by men have also contributed to an increased prevalence of gender-based violence. If we look at a bit about the impact of COVID-19 on education, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also elsewhere, we see that access to digital devices or the internet or having sufficient ICT skills are prerequisite for learning online in the current pandemic context. However, as these graphs will suggest to you, and these are findings from UNICEF-supported multiple indicator cluster survey and a recent analysis of ICT skills among young people, that gender gaps in ICT skills among adolescents in 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa exist at the expense of women, and that whether at home or at school, women or girls are at a disadvantage when it comes to digital literacy and access to digital infrastructure. So having traced that relationship and its significance of gender with education and conflict, let's talk and discuss a bit the key concepts of gender, sexuality, and sex. As Azim mentioned earlier, I draw on post-structuralist and post-colonial theories. And again, I'm drawing here on same theories. So my understanding of gender resists the modern binary of male and female, which conflates gender, sex, and sexuality. I draw on post-structuralist theories, particularly on gender's Butler's theory of gender performativity. She theorizes gender as performative, arguing that the inherent stability of gender is merely an illusion. Gender as performative draws attention to the social constructedness of gender and sex. As such, gender is something we enact and do rather than something that we are and own. The reproduction of gender identity is a continuous process, both in institutional settings as well as in everyday life, through actions and words. And why it gets reified, it reifies because of this continuous repetition, and it is sustained and regulated by social norms. And this means that gender identity is not an essential and biologically determined identity, but gender performativity both reinforces and is produced by gender norms in society, and that creates the illusion of the gender binary. This also means that we cannot assume gender to be a universal construct. Rather, its normative framing is contingent and shifting. So here is another term that Butler uses, the heterosexual matrix, by which she means to describe an invisible norm that does not appear to be constructed but comes through as natural, which defines everyone and everything as heterosexual until proved otherwise. This norm inscribes other ways of living as unnatural, with deviance, or other ways of living becomes just invisible. Moving the concept further, why gender identity becomes reified and becomes natural. It is through continued reaffirmation of gender enactments following cultural norms about definitions of masculinity, by which is meant the idealized enactments of being manly, and conceptions of femininity, which means the idealized enactments of being womanly. However, gender enactment, we are not free to enact as we would like. This is constrained, both as well as enabled by our multiple and intersecting locations in the social world, such as race, class, nationality, religion, ethnicity. So discourses of nation, ethnicity, culture, and gender, they intersect and regulate our gender performances. Women have been identified particularly as pivotal to imagining national identities and state formation, particularly in post-colonial contexts as well as new nation states. As in these contexts, the maintenance of culture and tradition is left mainly to women, since such work was relegated to the domestic sphere through the during the colonial regime. So the gender order is constituted by and is dependent on a power hierarchy of masculinities and femininities, at the top of which stands the ideal of hegemonic masculinity, which is constructed in relation to various subordinated masculinities, as well as in relation to women or femininities. I also want to highlight that power is central here in the construction of gender, and I'm using Foucault's concept of power, which is a regulatory system for social control, but it is not merely repressive. It is productive in the sense that it doesn't work only through imposition, but through the ways powerful discourses act on us to develop effective attachments to particular identity positions, specific notions of masculinities and femininities. So having shared with you my conceptualization of gender, now I want to critique existing theories of gender, both in practice and in policies. So particularly when it comes to education and conflict, studies exploring the relationships between education and conflict seldom focus on gender, or rather engage with gendered outcomes of conflict, girls being out of school, for example, rather than dealing with the gendered drivers of conflict. As I stated earlier, the literature talks about young men as most likely to be perpetrators of violence, and women largely as victims of gender-based violence. This limits understanding of the ways the social construction of gender identities is connected to conflict, as well as the mechanisms through which violence works. Also, it is important that education is a vital means of promoting gender equality, as well as mitigating conflict. But various educational interventions have been largely critiqued as just using adding women and stir approach to enhance access and outcomes. Such an approach fails to critically question the implications of power and knowledge in the constitution of gender identities and the enactment of violence. Policy, practice, and research are often informed by the gender binary, which is seen as static and as natural, and often intervention or explanations, they have the opposite effect of reasserting gender stereotypes and universalizing good practice. So now I move on to the theorization of violence and the relationship of gender at the theoretical level with violence. So what is violence? It's a socially learned expression of hegemonic masculinity, and therefore it is implicated in the construction of hegemonic masculinity. In this sense, violence can be seen as reproducing the gender order. The development of a violent culture and behavior depends on the building of hatred and subjugation of the feminine and subordinated masculinities. This indicates that gender relations are implicated in the very creation of violence. Violence is made possible by the existing of power-gender relations, and power-gender relations rely on violence for their reproduction. So in most contemporary societies, for example, Cockburn argues, even if in non-violent contexts, the kind of characteristics desirable in boys or men, such as competitiveness, combativeness, physical strength, assertiveness, courage, and ambition, these qualities themselves, even in peacetime, incline males to fighting. Patriarchal gender relations and masculinity in particular can drive conflict and insecurity. Men who are unable to live up to these social expectations of masculinity tend to be to readily embrace violence or use or enact violence in different contexts and settings. And it's the relationship of masculinity is to militarization doesn't rest there. Militarism requires sustaining a gender ideology as much as it needs guns and bullets, as one author argues. So militarized notions of masculinity, for example, even without conflict, tend to valorize domination and violence, motivate men to participate in violence, and support women to accept violence. And these are used by political and military to recruit combatants. So moving on further, how do we then use gender identities or masculinities to promote peace building? And many gender theorists argue that addressing masculinity is central to fostering peace building, because the social shaping of masculinity has to be addressed as a means to promote peace building if masculinities are the forms in which the dynamics of violence take shape. Gender norms are not merely, however, I argue, they are not merely a matter of our attitudes. They are also embedded within social and cultural, economic and political systems which reinforce and sustain them. Changing gendered structures which uphold gender norms is therefore important for addressing gender norms that drive conflict. Another way of, particularly on the last point of structures, another theorist to look at for understanding the relationship between gender and violence is Galton's conceptualization of conflict, which not only include direct violence or physical violence, but also, secondly, it includes structural violence, which is social injustices embedded into social structures like economy, law, religious institutions, family, etc. And also cultural violence, any part of the culture that renders direct or structural violence acceptable in society. And all these three forms of violence feed into and reinforce each other. As Africans and as South Asian, we need to remember the violence of colonialism as well. Understanding contemporary relations require to look at gender and violence in a long historical perspective, in the history of colonialism, the emergence of modernity, capitalism, and the coloniality of power, knowledge, and global capitalism. Gender was at the center of the symbolic, discursive, and direct violence utilized by European powers in establishing and legitimizing their superiority over the inferior other, that is, colonized people. The Western state creation and identifications were dependent on the binary of the civilized world against the uncivilized or feminized other to make possible, justify, and legitimize colonization in its various violent forms. So while pre-colonial societies had diverse gender regimes, including in Africa, colonialism transformed those through violence, and gendered violence played a formative role in shaping both the colonial and post-colonial societies. Alongside, again, direct violence, discursive power is important, which was utilized through the mobilization of the symbol of the oppressed native woman. And this was particularly the case in India, but I'm sure you can come up with examples from the African context as well. In the case of India, the oppression of Indian women was attributed to Indian religious traditions. The domestic slavery of the Indian woman was contrasted to the liberties enjoyed by the educated British woman. The dichotomy of modern versus tradition or religion redoubled the pressure on colonized women as they became the center of both colonial and anti-colonial social reform movements. And girls' education was legitimized in colonial interventions to emancipate Indian women and offered Indian nationalist and social reformist opportunities to regulate women's bodies and their mobility. So moving now to modern school and gender. School as we know it today is a modern institution that supports becoming gendered through everyday practices. And these practices have become utterly banal because of the gender performativity that I discussed earlier. And this very banality affords normalcy and legitimacy to some ways of doing gender while disqualifying others. The education of women in post-colonial countries is highly valued, but the symbolic significance of women into national imaginaries demands the production of idealized female subjectivities and identities, particularly through the curriculum and educational discourse. The intersection of religion, modernity, and gender can be performed in context, can be profound in context of conflict. For example, the study by Emerson and Levy looking at educational discourses and textbooks. The urge to protect the nation from these external or internal others, put women in a position of dependence and obedience, but also make them vulnerable to direct violence, verbal violence, as well as symbolic violence. In the new liberal imperial global relations, the association of modern schooling within the West makes schools a particular target by militants in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. So, talking more about how schools can contribute to conflict, schools, those whom of you are teachers, but also in looking back on your own schooling experience, you can see schools, teachers, students, they draw upon gendered identities and norms in ways that both normalize and reproduce the mutually intersecting relationship between gender and violence. So despite the widely held assumptions between education and women's empowerment, more often than not, education, both in the global north and the global south, sanctions and perpetuates injustices through the privileging of the traditionally masculine structures, textbook discourse, school practices, forms of identifications, and also gendered pedagogies. So, for example, the implicit curriculum where disciplinary regime or conflict, violence prevention is concerned, specifically, teachers target boys, often those from minority or economically disadvantaged backgrounds who are seen to be or assumed to be more violent. By contrast, non-disruptive girls can be ignored, or those who resist aggressively can be disciplined even harshly than boys. Girls and boys who fail to perform the dominant masculinities and femininities experience exclusion and sexual harassment by their peers, and schools often tend to ignore this kind of violence. We also see that in conflict-affected contexts, teachers are both victims and perpetrators of gender violence, and this is not just specific to conflict contexts, but also in non-conflict contexts. Textbook discourses often privilege violent masculinities, particularly through the teaching of history, selecting historical episodes and the portrayal of national icons. National icons are often men who are praised for not being afraid to dominate or overpower others. Domination thus becomes closely associated with masculinity, and violence becomes a signifier of accomplished masculinity. At the same time, femininity is represented as the passive recipient of male dominance. Women continue to be represented in stereotypical ways and are located in the culturally devalued sphere of the private sphere or the domestic sphere. This serves to perpetuate traditional power imbalances between masculinity and femininity. So therefore, destabilizing and challenging the gendered curriculum messages is very important. Teachers also have an important role. Their critical dialogue and self-reflection can also support in unlearning how they can perpetuate gendered norms that lead to violence and conflict. However, I argue that transforming gendered and transgendered norms to classroom and curriculum inputs alone is not necessarily possible. Other structures also need to change in supporting education in this transformative role. In my previous work, I used a particular framework that was developed by Novelli and his colleagues in an earlier piece of work that I contributed to, and they call it as a 4 R's framework of redistribution, recognition, reconciliation, and representation. And they in turn draw on Nancy Fraser's theories of social justice to develop this framework. Nancy Fraser considers social justice as a parity of participation. And this is only possible in the absence of 3 analytically distinct yet interconnected forms of injustices. She calls the first kind of injustice is socio-economic, and redressing it requires redistribution of material resources, goods, or services. Fraser's second kind of injustice is cultural or symbolic, which results from cultural domination, misrecognition, and disrespect, and remedying it requires the recognition of the marginalized social groups and affirmation of difference. Her third injustice is misrepresentation, which results from political marginalization and the exclusion of people from decision-making processes. Remedies based on representation seek a transformative politics of framing to encourage parity of participation. Now, Novelli et al. Adds a 4R reconciliation, particularly to take account of the conflict context, and they argue that conflict-affected and post-conflict contexts there is a need for processes of reconciliation so that historic and present tensions, grievances, and injustices are dealt with to develop a more sustainable and peaceful society. So I applied and extended this 4Rs framework, which can be a framework that can be potentially used in looking at the relationship between gender and context. So if we link that, if we apply a gender lens to this framework, redistributive gender justice in education will require equity and non-discrimination in education, access, resources, and outcomes for females and males. Recognitive gender justice in education will require respect for and affirmation of inclusive gender identities, as well as sexual identities in education, content, structures, and processes. Representative gender justice in education would require that both female and male education leaders, teachers, and other stakeholders have equity in education decision-making. And reconciliatory gender justice would involve replacing hegemonic masculinities linked to violence and domination with masculinities associated with non-violence, mutual respect, and equality. So now I am on the last part of my talk, and I just wanted to share with you a bit of Central Asia and how gender and education and conflict interrelate in that context. So Central Asian countries are quite new. They gained independence from Russia in 1991, and it not because of a nationalist movement, but because the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. It constitutes 5 countries, but our hub doesn't include Turkmenistan because currently it's very close to researchers. So my discussion will exclude Turkmenistan, but they share important commonalities. These people, Central Asian people, are predominantly they identify themselves as Muslim, but all countries have very fierce secular constitutions. This is a landlocked region with multiple ethnic groups and ethnicities often within the same country because of our arbitrary boundaries. That also is the case in Africa. Although in practice, Islam is practiced very differently across and within these diverse countries. The region as a whole has benefited from Soviet legacies, where gender equity in society and education was utilized by the Soviet Union as a marker of their distinction from the capital West. Therefore, education is largely accessible across gender groups, although inequities in access to quality education, particularly between rural and urban locations, is profound. In higher education, disparities are at the expense of men in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and at the expense of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. If we look at gender and conflict indicators, relatively speaking, if we compare it to Africa and South Asia, they are doing better in terms of human development index, gender gap index, gender development index, as well as levels of fragility or fragile state index. Although there is variation within countries, across countries, but it seems Kazakhstan has done well relative to other neighboring countries in Central Asia. Women usually do not experience violence in public spaces, but domestic violence is quite prevalent and is socially acceptable. And it's, earlier I talked about the relegation of culture to the domestic sphere. And that's what happened also during the Soviet Union. Cultural identities became limited to the domestic sphere. Although I also wanted to say that women tend to study particular disciplines like education and healthcare, and then they are concentrated in feminized sectors, and these are sectors which are not very well paid in Central Asia. So therefore, there are pay gaps between men and women across all Central Asian countries like elsewhere. Educational research in general is quite limited in the region, particularly because of language problems. So I'm talking about in English language, although over the last 5 years, we have seen a marked increase in educational research being published in English, and it is largely because of the establishment of flagship universities in the region, similar to Nazarbayev University. So, like other independent states, gender has become pivotal to discourses of national identity, and it's dominant across the region. The resurgence of nationalism has strengthened patriarchal relations and re-traditionalized discourses of gender roles and positions. Official narratives of national identity in Central Asia heavily focus on male heroes or strong men, but we don't know to what extent those narratives have infiltrated into textbooks and curriculum, but I'll share some research that I have undertaken. So these graphs are from a paper that is currently under publication. When published, I'll send you a link. But at least in the context of Kazakhstan, there is an overwhelming evidence indicating the dominant construction of masculinities as ingrained in text as well as images, which reinforces men's privileged position in the gendered hierarchy and men's domination of women. So this is in the leadership, but there are also graphs where distribution of STEM positions, and the ideal Kazakh man is portrayed as the protector, strong, brave, and self-sacrificing. He leads in politics, the fine arts, and literature. He not only excels in STEM disciplines, but is associated with knowledge in general. These masculinities are performed largely in the public sphere, and collectively they construct the ideal man as an embodiment of authority and awe, making him fearsome. And this is in contrast to emphasized femininities, which again overwhelmingly show textbooks placing emphasized femininities in a hierarchical position to hegemonic masculinities in ways to maintain women's subordination to men. As portrayed in the textbooks, the ideal Kazakhstani woman is associated with motherhood, culture, tradition, and beauty. Her vulnerability enables the ideal Kazakh man to protect her. These feminine virtues are oriented to compliance, nurturance, domesticity, and their positioning with respect to culture and tradition marks women as symbolic signifier of the nation. However, we may argue, even with these gender textbook messages, teachers have the ability to challenge those. So we collected teachers' views first through qualitative interviews, which then enabled us to develop a structured questionnaire, which was then administered to around 300 teachers. And despite these overwhelming gendered messages, when we asked teachers in the questionnaire who is more frequently shown in leading character roles in your subject-specific textbooks, less than 1 in 20 teachers, 1 in 5 teachers actually are aware of these textbook messages. And rather surprisingly, around over 11% think that textbooks mostly represent girls or only girls. In their narratives, teachers' perspectives were largely aligned with the textbook messages. So even when teachers were aware of the gender textbook messages, they didn't take it as their role to intervene, and their focus was largely on providing a good atmosphere for the content, so that learning outcomes are more equitable across the gendered groups. And when you ask them about idealized notions of men and women, like textbooks, they tend to see leadership as essentially male, and by and large, they are supportive of the gender norms that exist in Kazakh society. And for them, gender norms are natural and not amenable to intervention, and therefore it's not their role to intervene. So what does it say about gender and gender equality in and through education? So I'll stop there and hand over to Azim.
Thank you, Naureen. Sure. Thanks for very, in a sense, there's lots for us to engage in that discussion. So, colleagues, questions?
Okay, good afternoon.